I'm Amy Zawi with the July 22nd Red Alert Report. Why the Apartheid-Israel connection? The issue of apartheid in South Africa is a painful history that just about the entire civilized world condemned during its application and rightly celebrated when it was defeated. Desmond Tutu was a just hero combating this unjust practice, and that was certainly a clear example of systemic racism against people with black skin. The connection or conflation of the Arab-Israeli issue and the practice of apartheid is not new, but seems to have a resurgent popularity in recent days with the news and social media focus on racial issues worldwide, as well as the recent declaration of Israel of its sovereignty over the Jordan Valley, which I attend as a legally held position. Apartheid was a political and social system in South Africa during the era of the white majority rule. It enforced racial discrimination against non-whites, mainly focusing on skin color and facial feature as criteria. The word apartheid means distantiation in the Afrikaans language, which means to establish or create an emotional or physical distance. After the National Party gained power, again an all-white group, in 1948, this all-white government immediately began enforcing already existing policies on racial segregation. And under apartheid, non-white South Africans, which were the majority, would be forced to live in separate areas from whites and use separate public facilities. These racial divides were present before 1948, but were wholly institutionalized and increasingly made more stricter as of 1948. What is interesting is that during this same time period in the U.S., it was becoming increasingly more aware of its own prejudices and working hard to reverse them legislatively as well as culturally. And Israel was established in 1948, taking in Jews of every color and type while attempting to live peacefully side by side, not just with neighboring Arab nations, but with actual Arab neighbors who shared the same streets and stores and commerce. Apartheid as an institution and legal practice was thankfully dismantled in 1993, and while this legislation started the ball rolling and changing attitudes, racism still exists to this day. Unfortunately, it's human nature. So why then is the mantra among the race baiters and haters of Israel that Israel is an apartheid state? Apartheid had physical, facial, and skin color characteristics as criteria for separations of people akin only to the then recently dismantled Nazi regime. In all likelihood, it seems like Margaret Sanger was on retainer for her input. The ADL has a formal statement rebutting this continued accusation that Israel is apartheid. An accusation with such support that anti-Israel week-long college campus events are held annually called Apartheid Week. In the Anti-Defamation League's statement, it is, quote, "The treatment of Arabs by the State of Israel cannot be compared in any way to the treatment of the black majority under South African apartheid. There are no Israeli ideologies, policies, or plans to segregate, persecute, or mistreat the Arab population. No such laws exist in Israel, which in its Declaration of Independence, 1948, pledges to safeguard the equal rights of all citizens. Arab citizens of Israel enjoy the full range of civil and political rights, including the right to organize politically, the right to vote, and the right to speak and publish freely. Israeli Arabs and other non-Jewish Israelis serve as members of Israeli security forces. They are elected to parliament and appointed to the country's highest courts. They are afforded equal education opportunities, and there are always ongoing initiatives to improve the economic standing of all of Israel's minorities. These facts serve as the counter to the apartheid argument and demonstrate that Israel is committed to all democratic principles and equal rights for its citizens. Moreover, Israel's acceptance of a two-state solution as the outcome of bilateral Israeli-Palestinian negotiations for decades proves that the idea that Israel's goal is the persecution of Palestinians is patently false. Palestinians in the West Bank and the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip do indeed encounter hardships as the result often of Israelis' necessitated security policies, and these include things like checkpoints to access Israel and a security border. However, these procedures and structures have been developed to promote security as a response to violence and thwart potential a terrorist action, not to persecute or segregate. These practices are indeed wholly legal under international law, which allows a sovereign country to take measures to protect itself and citizens from terrorism. In 2011, an op-ed in the New York Times by South African Judge Richard Goldston, he wrote that while there exists a degree of separation between Israeli Jews and Arabs, quote, in Israel there is no apartheid, nothing there comes close to the definition of apartheid under the 1998 Rome Statute. A careful examination of the term apartheid as it was practiced in South Africa and the conditions in Israel will also lead one to dismiss this analogy as categorically false. But who is actually calling Israel apartheid? BDS activists on college campuses have beat this drum for years and have intersected themselves into other so-called social justice organizations trying to tie the plights of other groups and identities to Israel, being either Israel's fault or yet Israel being another example of said injustice. Even when South Africans themselves who have lived through and fought against apartheid have visited Israel and publicly claim that Israel is not an apartheid state, this is left unanswered. Israel does not practice apartheid was an article written by Chief Rabbi Warren Goldston, first published in early July. Rabbi Goldston had a public conversation with Chief Justice Mongo Mongo of South African Justice, who himself was an activist in taking down apartheid. This interview was hosted by the Jerusalem Post, and the two men were talking about how to overcome the formidable challenge of racism with a focus on how to actually address its roots. During the course of that conversation, it drifted to the topic of Israel. The Chief Justice expressed his view that the African National Congress, South Africa's government, their approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was misguided, and it was taking a one-sided approach to the conflict by ostracizing Israel and failing to take into account to the many complexities. He said, quote, we are denying ourselves an opportunity of being game changers in the Israeli-Palestinian situation. The rabbi found these remarks quite judicious and fair-minded, completely appropriate for a man of the justice system. Nevertheless, the rabbi's surprise when the ANC, the government in South Africa, released a blistering statement savaging the Chief Justice for his position and, quote, entering the arena of political commentary and for supporting Israel. This statement from the government then unleashed a media firestorm and op-eds, accusing the justice of judicial overreach and having failed to recognize that the Palestinians also have human rights, and even supporting a modern-day colonial genocide. One writer even accused this black Chief Justice, a stalwart of the black consciousness movement and a fierce anti-apartheid struggle veteran since he was in high school, of being, quote, oblivious to the black rights movement. And a complaint was lodged with the South African Judicial Services Commission, and the ANC has now urged the Speaker of Parliament to hold high-level talks with the Justice regarding his political views. Rabbi Goldstein went on in his article to enumerate the differences between Israel and the still healing South Africa. And the fact is, Israel is the only free democracy in the Middle East. And within the sovereign borders of the State of Israel, there currently lives 1.8 million Muslim and Christian citizens who are fully equal to their Jewish compatriots in every conceivable way. They participate side by side in elections, and they hold high-ranking positions throughout the various levels of government, including the parliament and, of course, the Supreme Court system. They all serve in law enforcement capacities and even in the army. And there has never been any separate facilities for Jews and to separate Jews and Palestinians. Schools and universities, benches, beaches, bus stations, trains, hospitals, all are unsegregated. Every Israeli citizen has no matter their ethnic or religious origin, has complete and equal full legal rights. Israel has none of the legislative machineries that were designed to discriminate and separate people. It has no Population and Registration Act, no Group Areas Act, no Separate Representation of Voters Act, no Separate Amenities Act, or any of the other myriad apartheid laws that were on the books. On the contrary, Israel is a vibrant liberal democracy with the kind of imperfections you would find in every free society. Nevertheless, they accord full political, civil, and human rights to all. Numerous judges were cited by Goldstein in the article for espousing their support for Palestinians and their condemnation of Israel. So currently, judges have political opinions and have been publicly sharing them. Rabbi Goldstein goes on, quote, South Africans deserve to hear both sides of the debate. Unfortunately, with savage attacks like those on Chief Justice Moging and the ceaseless efforts of various organizations and lobbying groups to silence these dissenting voices and to shut down the debate altogether, many aren't. Consider for a moment how extreme this is. The Chief Justice did not even actually express support for policies or actions of Israel. All he said is that we needed a more balanced approach and that the South African government should be engaging with both sides to make peace. Free speech is an essential element for political freedom and discourse to identify problems and solve it. Let us keep leaders from all nations in our prayers and pray for the truth to be revealed from every office, college quad, Zoom screen, street corner, TV studio, courtroom, legislative hall, executive office, radio frequency, podcasts, and social media posts. Israel is not apartheid, and it doesn't take much of a study to figure this out. So when you hear it, dispute it, no matter who's trying to bamboozle you. Shavua Tov, and have a great week.